Hello, everyone, and welcome to Night 2 of the 9th Annual Equine Industry Symposium, Cracking the Code. While we wait for other participants to join, we invite you to go to menti.com and enter the code on the screen, scan the QR code, or press the link in the chat to tell us where you are joining us from this evening. We will show the results in a couple of minutes. It looks like most people from America, and that's good. Now, our second question before we begin is, what word comes to mind when you think of equine welfare? A big range of answers came up for this question, with code of practice being the main one, so that's great. Now let's get started. In every corner of the horse industry, from owners to trainers to competitors, we face both daily challenges and long-term responsibilities that often demand our immediate focus. But beneath those individual tasks lies a shared mission, the welfare of the horse and the long-term growth of our industry. The Equine Industry Symposium was created to allow us to come together from all sectors to discuss how we can address these challenges, build better standards, and lead the way in shaping a brighter future for both the horse and our industry. It's about collaboration, innovation, and finding collective solutions to ensure we thrive together. Each year, we focus on a different theme of importance, and given that this year marks the start of the updating process for the Equine Code of Practice, our theme of cracking the code is particularly fitting. Yesterday, we heard from Jackie Wepbrook and Jeffrey Spooner on the processes behind the National Farm Animal Care Council Codes of Practices and the possibilities there are for the public to comment during the development of the Equine Code of Practice. Today, you will all have a chance to expand your knowledge on equine welfare and ask the questions that have been bubbling up in your minds. This symposium is hosted by the University of Guelph's Bachelor of Bioresource Management, Equine Management students as part of their second year Equine Event Management class. The BBRM Equine Management major is the first and only program of its kind in Canada, and it combines equine science and business management into one program. Also offered in a co-op format, students have the opportunity to learn through experiential, hands-on learning that equips them for diverse careers. First, I would like to say a big thank you to our sponsors who make the symposium possible: Ontario Equestrian, Equine Guelph, Mad Barn, and Schleese Saddlery. Stay till the end to enter for a chance to win a free Schleese Saddlery saddle fitting, a code for a free Equine Guelph course, and a gift with purchase from Mad Barn. If you were here last night and already filled out the survey, be sure to do it again tonight as you will get double entries. This evening, we will focus on global awareness of equine welfare, care, and welfare for you and your neighbor, how the code impacts every single equid around the world. We dedicate this session to a panel discussion with Bronte Forbes, Sally Taylor, Bettina Bobsien, and Sonja Keating, moderated by Francis Habile. Francis is a food and flower grower in Mississauga, Ontario, and he is currently completing a Master's of Science in Capacity Development and Extension at the University of Guelph. He's moderating for us tonight because the focus of his program is to facilitate knowledge mobilization throughout the community, which relates to one of the symposium's goals. We will start tonight's discussion off with some interesting topics, and then panelists will answer all your questions. Please feel free to add questions into the chat at any point during the session. Like yesterday, stay till the end for a chance to enter a giveaway for a free saddle fitting from Schleese Saddlery and a free Equine Guelph course. I will now turn it over to Francis.
Thanks, Annabelle. Good evening, everyone. My name is Francis Habile, your moderator for this evening. Tonight, we have Dr. Bronte Forbes, Dr. Sally Taylor, Dr. Bettina Bobsien, and Sonja Keating. Let's start off this panel with some self-introductions to acquaint ourselves with the audience. Let's start with Bronte.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me here. I think it's a really great initiative to have a more global perspective on this topic. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's views as well. As said, my name's Bronte Forbes. I'm an Australian. I graduated from Murdoch University in Western Australia. I'm a third generation horse vet, so some people have said my family don't learn from our previous mistakes. I originally started working in Western Australia for about 6 years in mainly thoroughbred breeding and racing industry. I then had the opportunity to go to Singapore to work at the Singapore Turf Club. And from there, had the opportunity to work at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. And I have then been back and forward between Singapore and Hong Kong for an extended period of time now. In fact, in a few months' time, I would have been living outside of Australia more than I had lived inside of Australia. I'm currently, with the end of racing in Singapore, I obviously had to find a new job, and I was lucky enough to given the opportunity to come back to the Hong Kong Jockey Club and offered a job in the veterinary regulation department, which is where I am now, head up currently at the moment, which has been an interesting transition for me, has faced a lot of challenges as well, which Sally will probably speak to as well. So I am also a member of an organisation called the International Group of Specialist Racing Veterinarians, which is, I think, important because we're a global organisation of regulatory veterinarians, which will speak to a lot of the things that I think we'll be speaking about tonight. And that's about it for me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Bronte. Sally, could you introduce yourself now?
Certainly. Thank you, Francis, and good evening, everybody. Or good morning, Bronte. My name is Sally Taylor, and I'd also like to echo Bronte's thoughts about how pleased I am and privileged to be invited to join you today, and what a fabulous initiative this is. So I am Sally Taylor. I work in the UK for the British Horseracing Authority. I graduated from Cambridge University and spent 14 years in first opinion equine practice. That was a mixture of race horses, sport horses, and pleasure horses. I have always had an interest in racing and rode out exercise racehorses from being a teenager, and an opportunity to join the British Horseracing Authority, the BHA, arose in 2016, and I joined their team of regulatory vets, and we term veterinary officers. In 2021, I became head of equine regulation, safety and welfare, which is a really interesting and challenging role. It gives me the opportunity to develop processes and practices to improve safety and welfare of racehorses, both on the racecourses and also the herd, the training herd, which there's 14 or 15,000 horses in training at any one time in Britain. Aside from my job and my interest in horses, I have always ridden, and now my 3 children have ponies, so I'm a pony club mother as well. But it allows me to see the challenges that the industry face from a different perspective, and not just from an elite sport perspective. So thank you very much, everybody.
Yes, thank you so much, Sally. Now we can call upon Sonja to do her introduction.
Hi, I'm Sonja Keating. I am from the U.S. I'm based in Lexington, Kentucky at the Kentucky Horse Park. I work with the United States Equestrian Federation, which is the national governing body for equestrian sport in the U.S. I've been with the organization for almost 19 years. I've been in a legal role. I am a lawyer for that entire time. And also about 2 years ago, I assumed the role of Chief Operating Officer. So I do oversee some of the operational divisions of the organization, including the veterinary department. In my role here, I work very closely with our vet team on matters that involve biosecurity and on our anti-doping program. So we do regulate for all of the sport horse competitions in the US, the drugs and medications, and we conduct the collection of samples, the testing of those samples, promulgate the regulations around those, and then we also handle the results management and then the response and resolution to any positives that come out of that. We work closely with the International Federation, the FEI, And I've had experience doing that for almost 19 years as well. Finally, as some of you may know, in the US, there was a federal statute passed in 2020 to provide a uniform set of anti-doping regulations and safety regulations for the horse racing industry. And I do serve as a consultant and an advisor to the group that manages the anti-doping regulations. So looking forward to talking to you all this evening. Horse welfare is a priority for the U.S. Equestrian Federation. We are currently changing rules to try to strengthen the protection of the horse, and looking forward to hearing what the panel has to say.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sonja. Bettina, could you do your introduction?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm just super excited to have such a big group of interested people here today. Knowledge about the codes is critical to implementation, and the best way to do that is through industry and by industry. I'm a veterinarian who graduated in 1989 from the University of Saskatchewan and achieved specialty designation in equine practice in 2006. Along with my husband, we developed a full-service small animal and equine hospital in Nanaimo, British Columbia. We had a surgeon there, and we're able to provide full medical and surgical services on our island, which was kind of a very big win for horses in our area. In 2010, I took a contract position with the BCSPCA in Humane Canada to represent the welfare chair, the welfare seat, at the Equine Code of Practice table, and that's the current Equine Code of Practice that's under discussion for tonight. And that I had always had a tremendous interest and passion for welfare in the bigger picture, and it was there that I drank the NFACC Kool-Aid, and it's been essentially a huge part of my life ever since. I'm currently chair of the Equine Code Committee that is revising that 2013 Code of Practice that I worked on. I'm also currently the vice chair of NFACC writ large. I do have a degree in animal science, so I'm quite interested in all animal agriculture. So I'm able to develop that interest a little bit in my role at NFACC. I've served as the chair of the Equestrian Canada Health and Welfare Committee chair, and I was recently the chair of the CVMA, Canadian Veterinary Medical Association Animal Welfare Committee, and I've recently joined the AAEP, so the American Association of Equine Practitioners Welfare and Public Policy Committee, also the Canadian Council on Animal Care, their Farm Animal Committee. So keeping myself busy doing all that stuff. Still practicing, was up most of the night with a colic in the middle of a horrendous windstorm, and life goes on. So I'm afraid I can't join you. We have no power and we have no internet. All we have is spotty cell phone service, which is why I'm calling in. And my apologies, but we're in a little bit of a free fall where we're living due to a climatic event.
Thank you so much for joining us, Bettina. We're going to move on to our first panel question. Our first question for all of you is, how can jurisdictions communicate amongst each other to improve horse welfare?
I can probably start there from our perspective. We're obviously a small country in the middle of Asia, and we rely a lot on other countries for our horses, both importing of horses, and then we have to export our horses. So we have no breeding industry in Hong Kong. The horses are all brought in to race or in for the equestrian side, and then have to retire out of Hong Kong. So we have I think a unique perspective on international collaboration. What we think is important is building international protocols through organisations like the IFHA, the International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities. We work closely with the FEI to build protocols and standards that I think is a useful thing to do when you're looking at communicating welfare standards and what's important for us. We also need to keep in mind that what is important for us may have a lower priority for other jurisdictions and vice versa, but that's a good conversation to have with people. Conferences and meetings are other areas where we find is very useful, where all the racing administrators or the regulators, the regulatory vets may get together, present any evidence-based medicine they have developed, or present ideas or issues that they have. And then collaboration between jurisdictions, with international racing becoming a lot more common. And this is the busy time of year for everyone, the US, Australia, and us here in Hong Kong. Also in the Middle East now, this is a time of year where horses can move between 2 or 3 jurisdictions and race in those 2 or 3 jurisdictions within a couple of months. So collaboration on protocols, pre-import protocols, medication protocols, and those sort of areas I think is very useful.
Thank you. Sonja, do you have any thoughts on that? I know there's a difference. The US is much larger.
Yeah, the US is, you know, for us in terms of communicating, you know, we actually just returned from Del Mar, and did a collaborative session with some of the representatives from the horse racing industry, which is a little unusual because there are some real distinctions between, you know, horse racing and sport horse, at least in the US, from a governance perspective and in terms of what the regulations are, you know, around the care of those horses. We found it to be very helpful and a reminder of how important it is that we do try to collaborate across, you know, across, for us, even across the breeds and disciplines. So we govern several international disciplines that are under the auspices of the International Federation. A couple are involved in the Olympic movement, but then most of what we govern are outside of that, and they are domestic. So we do try to ensure, you know, synergy between all of those national organizations that kind of govern the breed-specific and discipline-specific sports in this country. And we work too through the American Horse Council, and we find that to be valuable in terms of collaborating with some, you know, the American Quarter Horse Association, the cutting, the other sport horse or sports within the US that typically, you know, we don't really meet up with. And this is another perfect example, I think, of you know, especially internationally, collaborating and communicating, which is fantastic.
I think it might be worth mentioning the International Federation for Aftercare of Racehorses, which is a global organization very much dedicated to looking at this problem that we all face of what happens to horses once they leave their racing career. And I think that's a good example of how communication can be quite effective in that area. We in Britain have only very recently realised how important this is to communicate across our different disciplines. And last year was the first meeting of the Horses in Society group, which got together representatives of, as you've just described, Sonja, we have riding for the disabled, we have police horses, army horses, racing and other elite sports mixed in. And that group created a charter for the horse. So everybody agreed on certain overriding principles of horse welfare that each organisation could sign up to. I think that that's a really important thing, and potentially that needs to be extended even further globally, because we need to learn from each other what the challenges are, because ultimately they will become the same challenges. So what perhaps Bronte has as an issue in the public's mind of horse welfare, or perhaps the cultural differences between the nations, which mean that the way horses are treated it's different across the world, and we need to understand that and better try and align to this overarching ideal that we kind of need to define and strive for, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it's especially important for us because we now understand that we're held account to the public perception not only in Hong Kong but also where our retired horses go to and where our horses come from. So it's not unusual for us to be held account by the Australian media where most of our horses come from, because people follow those horses up to Hong Kong. Also, when our horses return to the UK or Europe, New Zealand, Australia, some will be going to the US now, we feel we still have a responsibility for those horses. So we have to have a level of welfare acceptance that both the people in Hong Kong will accept, but also the people in those countries where we're sending or getting our horses from. So it's becoming more and more important. We also understand that for the majority of people, so there's a lot of horse people on this talk, but for the majority of people that don't know anything about horses, a horse is a horse. So if there's an issue with a horse in an Olympic event, it looks bad for the racing industry. If there's an issue with a horse in the racing industry, it looks bad for the equestrian industry. So it's now becoming, the world with the social media and the ease of getting information, we have to all be tarnished with the same brush, basically. So we have to have the same level of welfare.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bettina, do you have any thoughts from your perspective?
You've absolutely talked about the Canadian Achilles heel, and that is, cross jurisdictional issues. In Canada, the animal welfare law is regulated by the provinces. So every province and territory has its own in sort of enforcement and provincial law that governs animal animal welfare legislation. And then we have the federal government that sort of is the bigger overseeing body. And this is perhaps where NFACC has, so that's the National Farm Animal Care Council, and they're the ones that are in charge of the process of the development of the equine code of practice. And that has become a kind of a unifying voice for Canada. It's an opportunity for provincial legislators to take that code of practice and use it in enforcement for minimum standards. So it's definitely, NFACC has been huge in trying to achieve some degree of harmonization of animal welfare regulation all the way across Canada, because what we find is when animals move across the country, wherever you have changes in jurisdiction, there are always gaps. And when there's gaps, there's animals that fall between the cracks. So this equine code and this updated equine code is a very, very powerful tool. Having said that, we have a huge country which is geographically and climatically extremely diverse. So to try to standardize things like shelter requirements across Canada is extremely challenging because of the great diversity both within the horse industry and within the climate. So it's tough sledding sometimes, working on that legislative stuff, but it is super, super important. We also have the Canadian Animal Health Surveillance System is sort of developing as a little bit of a place where a lot of policy stuff is going to find a home, and hopefully that is going to allow us to collaborate better, cross jurisdictions better, to achieve a more unified standard for horses in Canada. I agree with the previous panelists. I think our industry, our both sport and recreational horses, is in extreme risk at the moment with respect to the whole concept of social license. And we're seeing some situations in Canada now where there's enough of a movement of people that feel that nothing should be done to a horse at all, short of being allowed to stand in a field. And if we don't get our house in order within the social license conversation, we may find that someone's going to do it for us, and we are not going to like what that's going to look like. I don't think this can be taken seriously enough, and I'm so relieved to see that the FEI is finally starting to run with this. Because for example, in Canada, we've been battling this noseband tightness issue with Equestrian Canada now I wrote my first letter 10 years ago, or probably 12 years ago now. And what happens, I'm finding, is that unless FEI makes a move, the national federations won't. So they have a huge role to play. Thank you.
Thanks, Bettina. So on that note, given all of our different perspectives and this increasing pressure from the public, how do we define a minimum standard of care?
Well, in
I'll take that.
Britain, sorry, go, but please, Bettina.
No. Okay. Well, I'm on my soapbox, and I haven't quite stepped off yet. So, well, this is where the equine code of practice comes in, and the important thing about establishing a code of practice is it's not written by veterinarians, it's not written by animal welfare advocates. It is written with the input of all important stakeholders. So that includes ranch, rodeo, racing. It's a consensus-based document, and I think that's what's really important when you're establishing minimum welfare standards, and it's also your opportunity to showcase improved standards and what we're striving for. Thank you.
That's very interesting to hear you speak of the code of practice like that, Bettina. Currently, our minimum standards here in the UK are defined by law, and the Animal Welfare Act 2006 defines minimal standards for sentient animals, which horses obviously are. Now, within racing, we have the rules of racing, and they also are the minimum standards. We're currently writing a code of conduct, which we're hoping to be more aspirational than the minimum standards, which is why it's so interesting to hear you talk of your code of conduct being your minimum standards. We recognise that the minimum standards are just that, and most horses in racing are kept to a much higher standard and have a much better life than that of the minimum standard. And so our code of conduct is going to be more aspirational in that respect, giving people the idea of what they can, what's possible, the art of what's possible, and what we'd like people to be aiming for.
Yeah, I think Sally brings up an interesting point there, which I'd like other people's views. But I think racehorses are kept at a higher welfare standard, and if we are honest about it, it's an economic decision. If your racehorse isn't well and healthy and happy, it probably won't perform well. But we also then need to realise once that horse finishes racing, we also need to make sure that horse is kept at a good welfare standard. The other point with that, to me, is although I do believe that racehorses, certainly in Hong Kong, are kept at a very high welfare standard, there are certain issues in racing that are picked up and have poor public perception. And those things are things we have to work on. So the whip rule is different in every single jurisdiction that I know of, and very different in every single jurisdiction. And I mentioned the IFHA previously. There are committees on there working on specific rules, trying to make them the same across jurisdictions. But it's a very difficult thing because it's a very unique pressure in each different jurisdiction. But I think, I mean, the easy answer is you look at science and you look at the 5 domains, but I think that's a little bit simple because certainly where we are, we have a lot of different pressures on us that will be very different to the US, different to the UK, and different to Australia.
On that point, Bronte, we're under we're being involved in and listening to increasing amount of conversation about how we look after racehorses, which Hong Kong would also struggle with this. The idea of keeping horses in quite relatively biosecure small boxes for 23 hours a day doesn't fit with the modern idea of good welfare, and there's increasing pressure in that area to look at it and consider it, and I think that that's something that's quite important. And it goes back to what we said about sharing what's coming, because what's coming to us ultimately will come to Hong Kong, and maybe it's already in the US and Canada, and we could have got the heads up from you beforehand.
I think one challenge that we have in the US is we don't really have a uniform standard across the country. So, each state has its own laws regarding, how it defines neglect and abuse. And even within the states, there's different municipalities that have their own regulations, and the resources that those, regulatory bodies have, they vary. And so oftentimes what we see is there are some states that are seemingly a little more, concerned about animals or animal friendly, where you can get support if there's some allegations and, for an investigation. But there's a lot of jurisdictions where there's just not, they don't have the resources. And we have a lot of challenges here in the US as it relates to the sport horse side of the industry. In terms of the, I think, alignment across the stakeholders, it's important. But there's so many longstanding traditions that trying to get these different, breeds and disciplines to align on some of these standards it's a challenge. I mean, it's a real challenge. And, someone mentioned the importance of the International Federation, and I couldn't agree more. If they set a standard internationally, then oftentimes you'll see the national federations that'll fall into line. Of course, there's some countries that have more stringent horse welfare regulations than others, but we're really at a crossroads in the US right now, with some of these abusive incidents that are going viral on social media. At least our organization's under a lot of pressure for, holding people accountable. And historically, we have not had jurisdiction over that type of behavior that occurs outside of our competition showgrounds. So in other words, if there's some abuse that's happening at home or at a private facility unrelated to a competition, then that's not something that's been, within our jurisdiction, unless there's two caveats, unless the criminal authorities, there's some charges filed, or if in a civil lawsuit, there's a determination by a court or other agency that there's been some kind of neglect or abuse. We have gone through went through a legislative consultation process, and we did adopt a rule that will go into effect on December 1st that does broaden the jurisdiction and beginning December 1st for any type of allegations of abuse or unethical treatment of the horse. We're actually expanding it beyond abuse to unethical treatment of the horse. Then we will have jurisdiction, and we can take disciplinary action, which is a huge pivot for us in the US. And, it's going to be, there's going to be quite a bit of resources. But, one challenge we have with our social license here is the misunderstanding that people outside the industry have, because I do think that for the most part, I think these sport horses are very well cared for, and we need to do a better job of educating how well cared for they are. It's just some of the bad apples that, you have this social media frenzy, and people seem to think that if, they send us a video that went viral on Facebook, that we can immediately impose some kind of, ban on someone from participating in sport, but there are legal processes in place, to ensure that, people have the right to be heard, to ensure, we have to get forensics involved sometimes to ensure that the images and the videos that we get are unaltered and they're authentic. And AI now, plays another big challenge for us when it comes to the legal processes. So we're trying to, we're trying to move forward in this area, increase education, strengthen our regulations and the resources around holding people accountable, while also ensuring fairness. And then we've got another set of regulations that's going to our board in January to kind of help with this, but it's a big change. A lot of our stakeholders are under the misimpression that we have a SWAT team that's going to be coming onto private property, searching and seizing and doing all that, which in the US we cannot. That'd be trespassing, and we don't have those resources. And certainly that's not the intention, but it's but getting the point across and communicating effectively and educating people it's a challenge. It's a real challenge.
Mm-hmm. What's one thing you would say would help improve that communication and engagement and awareness?
I mean, that's a great question. I think here at US Equestrian, we have national affiliate organizations that are associated with us that are sport specific. So there's the United States Hunter Jumper Association that's specific to the hunter discipline and the jumper discipline. The US Eventing Association. I think probably we could maybe work better with those associations to help get the messages to the members and the participants that might pay a little more attention to what's coming from their very discipline specific organization. Social media, short sound bites. People don't want they don't want to read long regulations or long letters or long communications. I mean, we're in this environment now where people are used to, TikToks, and they're used to getting and consuming information in seconds, not in minutes. So really trying to figure out the most effective way to communicate is, that's what the communications teams, the communication team is for, but change is hard. Change is hard, and trying to lead and get people to come with us as opposed to pulling them along is the ideal. We started talking about the social license to operate and kind of the threat to the social license at our annual meeting a couple of years ago, and trying to get some publicity around that, and really just trying to provoke conversations. Challenge these recognized affiliates to hold up the mirror and look at their particular breed and what maybe has always been accepted, but today the times are changing, and what may be viewed as not favorable anymore, and how are they going to implement some changes. And I think really sparking those conversations and engaging people is our best way to, our most effective way to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
And on
easy.
that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it's not easy. Sometimes when you propose a new regulation, it gets a lot of attention. That's not the ideal way for us to communicate with our membership, though.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to follow on something that Sonja said in response to your question, Francis, because I think what's important to remember is there's been a lot of work done on social license in other industries. I mean, originally it was first used in the mining and extraction industries, and we can learn from how those industries, sports companies have responded to the social license. And I think there's several things that we can just work towards, which is the communication piece. And we do know that to maintain a social license, we need to have legitimacy, credibility, and trust. And if we hold those values at heart and we demonstrate those values more widely, then people will have more confidence in our industry, even without perhaps the detail that we'd like them to know. But if they trust that we make the right decisions and that we show clearly what we have done, the good and the bad. I think in the past we've been guilty of trying to conceal some of the bad bits that we might not feel so proud about, and that doesn't stand up anymore. We need to show those bits and explain what we're going to do to make it better, and then make it better, not just pay lip service to it.
And on that note of
sorry.
Oh, sorry.
And I think following on from both Sonja and Sally's points, like Sally, I have a wife and daughter that have an equestrian horse, and it sometimes surprises me how much they don't understand about the racing industry, and they will come to me about rumours they've heard and such. And I think a really good first step, which is why it's great we're all here today, is for all of the equestrian industries to start working together. I think probably one of the best good news stories you can see, certainly from our perspective, is a retired racehorse that becomes a good eventing horse. I mean, that's a good news story for both sides. And we should be, like, our first step of communication, I think, is to get all our ducks in a row in both the equestrian, racing, breeding, all those industries together. And then everyone puts out, like Sally said, good news stories, which is something I think in the racing industry we've been very bad at. We historically haven't wanted people to know the bad things about the industry, and we've been afraid to tell them the good things in case they ask the bad things. So I think we've sort of shot ourselves in the foot a little bit there, and I'm glad to see that's changing a lot.
Bettina, you have your hand up.
Yes, I wanted to expand a little bit on Sonja's comment about change being hard. And this is something that we've really learned about at the code development table. And in particular, one of the strategies to make change is to provide evidence. And animal welfare evidence always seems to be lacking. But gradually there's been and in some areas, quite frankly, burgeoning knowledge with respect to horse welfare that is science-based / science-informed. And I think sometimes that where our industry gets very, very mired in traditions, because we are an industry of traditions. Humans have been keeping horses for thousands of years, or creeping or working with horses for thousands of years, and it's sometimes very difficult to change ideas that there may not ever have been any real basis for. But now we have a better understanding of equine physiology, better understanding of equine cognition, better understanding of equine sentience, and what horses really need to be happy. And I think that providing evidence for our ask for the change is a very powerful tool.
And on that note of accountability, should owners and breeders be responsible for what happens to their horses later on in their lives after they've been sold?
I'm happy to answer that and say yes. I firmly believe that, and coming from a commercialized industry, that everybody profits along the way, from the breeding farms to the sales yards, to the trainers, to the owners. So certainly in Hong Kong now, we have taken the stance that if the horse races in Hong Kong, we've profited and both financially and in enjoyment of that horse being in Hong Kong, and that we have a responsibility for that horse for the rest of its life, basically. Now, it's very difficult for us to be fully responsible for that horse, but we certainly have things in place now where we will assist that horse after it has raced in Hong Kong. And that is one kind of bear bug I have with the industry is that sometimes as the horse moves through its life cycle in the industry, people don't take responsibility after that. I've sold the horse. It's not my problem. It's your problem now. And I think people are now realizing that has to change. But obviously for us, and I think we'll speak about different cultural and jurisdiction issues. For us, that's a significant issue because we have a good equestrian industry here, but it's very small, and we don't have a breeding industry. So we most of our horses, 95% of them are geldings. So we have to find homes for those horses, and they're easily recognizable as Hong Kong horses or previous Hong Kong horses.
Mm-hmm. Those are good points. Bettina?
I think what a big piece of that accountability puzzle is permanent identification. And that's what we are trying to move towards in Canada finally. I know in Europe you're much further ahead, but I completely agree with you that this idea that a horse will be sold half a dozen or more times in its life. This is a sentient animal that's bonded to people, and as you say, many people profit along the way, and then as the horse's value drops, frequently its welfare drops, and ultimately it ends up in a very bad place. And I think if ultimately the buck starts with the breeder, that's not a bad place to start. But the big thing is we have to know where these horses came from, because it's remarkable how their past can simply vaporize when suddenly they're no longer worth anything. And there's some interesting programs that I've heard about. They attempted a program in Ontario, but unfortunately that didn't come to fruition. But Equestrian Canada, we've talked about the same thing, and that is when a horse gets registered with his breed registry, the breeder is required to pay into some kind of a emergency / end of life fund. So that horse, regardless of where it ends up, there will always be funds there for humane euthanasia and disposal. That is an interesting place to start. And oftentimes, many of our breeders, if they ever find a horse that they have bred, even if it's 20 years later, that is in a bad situation, they are more than happy to step up and do the right thing. But that horse can't tell us where he came from. So until we have permanent identification for all horses involved in sport, and preferably all horses that are bred by humans, that's going to be a tough thing to enforce.
I agree with the points that have been made that everyone who profits from a horse has a responsibility towards it. What I struggle with is what is happening to a horse now that has been passed on from someone, sold, how they can have responsibility for the state that horse is in at the time. And I feel that the overall responsibility for a horse's welfare has to be the current owner, which doesn't remove everybody else who's profited from that horse from some responsibility towards it. Although how you create a framework for that, I'm not sure. I mean, Bronte, you've explained one which could work in our racing industry as well. But if you extend that to every other horse or pony, and in the UK now, every horse, pony, donkey must be microchipped as of 2020. Thoroughbreds have been microchipped for a long time. I'm not sure how long actually, but all our racehorses can be traced. I mean, now every horse in theory can be traced, although the government's central equine database isn't quite up and running and functioning in the manner that it's envisaged that it will be in the future. But I still feel that the responsibility, that overall responsibility, has to be the current owner, and that maybe the previous owner's responsibility lies in ensuring that they are selling that horse on to someone who is competent, capable, and more than likely to look after that horse properly. I think there's a lot of transactions that occur in the UK where people are simply taking the money and they have no thought for that next step of that horse. And the point that Bettina made, the connection with humans, the horses being passed on, it becomes a commodity rather than an animal, and that's something that doesn't fit very well with what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct. The other issue is if you don't hold the the last person responsible, it's too easy to go back to the stakeholder with the most money in the chain, which is something we've struggled with. And how do we deal with that? If it's easy just to say 4 owners after retirement, I don't want this horse anymore, the Jockey Club had it once, they should pay for it. I think it removes responsibility from those people. So I think that's very important. So, I mean, the way we deal with it now is we have an emergency fund that we will, if a horse does get in trouble in New Zealand or Australia or somewhere else, then we have a fund there to help that horse. But we, as best we can, make sure that the last person that was responsible for that horse is accountable for that situation. And then we make sure the horse is looked after and removed and rehomed. But I think that's an important piece of the puzzle, is to make sure that person is accountable, and that if possible, they don't receive horses from Hong Kong anymore. You know, that sort of mentality that if you're not going to look after them, then we don't want this person having, you know, Hong Kong horse. Now, you can't stop that. As I'm sure we're all aware, you cross a country border, the rules change and the laws change. And in Australia is the same a little bit. In the US, you cross a state line and the rules change. So it's not easy, but I agree wholeheartedly that the last person that has that horse has the most responsibility. If you're going to take on a horse, you have to look after it. If you can't, then you can approach the people further back the line to help.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on to our last panel topic, Sonja, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Sorry. No, nothing that hasn't been stated already. I mean, it's an interesting one for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So our last panel topic is, we are aware that the USEF has made the recent decision to expand their authority. How do you think this will positively impact the equine industry?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, our board did adopt a new rule that will expand our jurisdiction, so that if we do get, you know, reported abuse or neglect or unethical treatment to the horse that occurs away from competition, then we would be in a position where we could take some type of disciplinary action. Now, importantly, it's not going to be retroactive. And that's something that's, you know, we're gonna have to manage some expectations. So in other words, when this new rule goes into effect on December 1, on December 2nd, if somebody sends us videos from 10 years ago for abuse that happened at a home facility, we're not going to be able to address that. So we wouldn't have the resources. That would be a challenge as well. So it's only for misconduct that occurs from December 1st forward. But you know, I think having that broader ability to hold the participants in our sport accountable for wrongful conduct will serve, I think, in part as a deterrent effect. And also for those that are, you know, so committed to the welfare of the horse and to the good and sustainability of the sport, you know, they want those people held accountable, and they want to rid the sport of people that are not going to take good care of the horses and that are going to abuse the horses. So and those of you who are involved in disciplinary or legal processes, you know, can appreciate that it's often, you know, it's a challenge. You know, there's the participants in our sport typically have a lot of resources. This is not only their livelihood, but a lot of these folks have been, you know, they've been in the industry for, you know, for generations. And so, you know, banning them or suspending them for a long period of time from participation has a huge detrimental impact. And so they do, you know, they do fight these. And so you've really got to ensure that your processes, that you're following your processes, that you're, you know, affording people a fair opportunity to defend themselves before, you know, the disciplinary panel, so that, you know, you can try to have sanctions are imposed upheld as it goes through the system. Because otherwise, You know, I think Sally, you raised a really good point about, you know, in terms of credibility and, you know, really building that trust among the stakeholders and the public, you know, to have, the credibility, the accountability is important, but if we're kind of going after people and we're not following processes and, you know, decisions are getting overturned, we're not going to have the trust of anybody. So it's got to be done correctly. And it does take some patience because these, you know, and there's some cases that are pending before our international federation right now that have been there for quite some time, and people, you know, they get anxious because they want to see, you know, they want to see justice, and they want to see it quickly. And trying to remind people that these investigations are not criminal investigations. We do not have that kind of authority. We don't have subpoena power. We can't get warrants to search people's property or search people's, you know, whether it's their real property, like their farms or their cell phones or whatnot. Unfortunately, I wish we did have that power, but we don't. Then it can be challenging. And I think there's a real fear from some people, depending on who the bad actor is, of retaliation. You know, so people can be really reticent to come forward and participate in proceedings. So we do have a whistleblower policy in effect. We do have anti-retaliation policies in effect. We do also have good faith reporting policies in effect. So it's I think this is going to strengthen the position over time, and I think it's going to be really good for the sport, so long as the organization, you know, uses its authority consistently and judiciously, which under the current leadership, no question, that'll be done.
Thank you, Sonja. Before we move on to our Q&A section, does anyone else have anything to add to what Sonja said? Okay,
I will
let's
say,
move.
if I can just make one more comment, and then I promise I'll stop talking, but I will say that our International Federation, their annual General Assembly just occurred a couple weeks ago. And while there, the representatives from the US were contacted by some of the leaders from the other national federations that want to meet with us and talk about how we were able to introduce this new regulation and implement it, because they're interested in doing the same thing in their country. So I think that will be, if we can lead by example, I think that will have another very positive impact on the industry, because as we've talked about, regardless of whether you're in horse racing or, you know, you're in roping or, you know, you're in show jumping, whatever is going viral out there, the public, they don't really differentiate how those horses are used in the industries. And so what's any kind of negative publicity that's happening in one place is affecting another. And the same is true regardless of where it's happening around the globe, right? So, you know, you'll get a big story that comes out before the Olympic Games and about, you know, a rider from another country, and they don't always distinguish, was that rider from Germany? Were they from Great Britain? Were they from the US? And the impact is, it's a global impact. So I think we all got to try to work to the extent we can in lockstep to try to do what's best for these horses, because they love their job. I mean, they really love, you know, they love their jobs.
Thank you so much for that insight, Sonja. We're going to move on to our Q&A section. We have some questions from the chat. Our first one is, in what ways are governing equestrian bodies moving forward to deal with social license? And what specific horse welfare aspects are you prioritizing?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I can tell you on the international front with the FEI, our International Federation, they appointed an ethics commission maybe 2 years ago or so that's really been studying this issue. They committed a big financial investment as well, and they're looking at different, you know, they're looking kind of across all types of, training practices, everything from whether drugs and medications and any type of other practices that should be prohibited. And I know that, it takes time, but they're certainly trying to move that forward and engage the representatives from the national federations on what they're doing. Another rule that we have introduced here is what I'll refer to as the blood rule. And in the US, we've never had one. And for those of you that are familiar with or watched the Olympic Games, in the US, we had our first dressage horse that went out at the Olympic Games. That particular horse gets a little nervous with crowds that are kind of in stadiums above it. And it was getting a little nervous beforehand and nicked its leg with a shoe. The rider and horse did their performance, and because those rules around dressage that are specific to dressage are very, very strict about blood, and there was some blood. Now we believe that the horse was not injured or in pain, or that it was really a welfare issue, but the rule's black and white. And so it was eliminated, and the rest of the team didn't even get to compete. So we're introducing, or we have introduced, it's now going around for consultation, a blood rule for the national competitions. And it's quite controversial to try to get to the right place, because you don't want the pendulum to swing so far over, but yet you really need, you need to try to define it the best you can. And I think that's one example where I think people are really, they're really digging in and looking at all of the, the different issues and being mindful of, a lot of it too is perception, some of the way it's perceived by the public. And even though it might not be harmful to the horse, we have to be mindful of that. We have to, in this day and age with social media, we have to be mindful about how, how we care for our horses in competition and how that's perceived.
Could you share your thoughts, Bronte?
Yeah, I think for the racing industry, our regulations around medication and such are quite mature and are always developing. But where I think the biggest push at the moment for us is traceability and aftercare. Sorry, did you get that?
Yes. Bettina, do you have any thoughts?
Not much different than what's already been raised. I'm afraid that I'm a little bit more cynical than Sonja is about horses loving their jobs and most people doing a good job, and lots of problems with public perception. Sadly, I feel like there are so many things in horse sport that are appallingly wrong. Over tight nose bands, tail alterations, and tail injecting, tying horses' heads to fixed objects. That's in some of the Western, I'm not going to mention specific breeds, but tying horses' heads up for hours and hours and hours before competition so that they travel with a really low head carriage. I mean, I hate to say it, but, racing, the racing industry is probably they're the ones that most recently crashed the plane. If you know that analogy, you always want to fly with the airline that most recently crashed the plane. Racing has been under so much scrutiny that I feel like they're really trying to take a lot of positive steps around drug controls, around transparency, around monitoring horses in an effort to avoid catastrophic breakdowns. I feel like sport and show horses have a lot of work to do, and the reason the changes in these rules with respect to having jurisdiction outside of competitions is because there's a big problem. And we know there's a big problem, and unless we get serious about this, these training in quotation mark videos are going to continue to surface because people do all kinds of things to horses in the name of fame, fortune, and ego. And we need to have everybody that has the privilege of being involved in horse sport understand that it is you have a massive responsibility to the sport, to the animal, to the international, to the whole international world of horse sport, because it's been raised many times. When one of us goes rogue now, everybody looks bad. And we just need way more accountability. I would love to say people can be trusted, but they can't. They've proven it. And you can talk to Temple Grandin about slaughter, about welfare in the horse slaughterhouse. And Temple has been saying since about 1995, until you camera everything, the same things keep happening. So we're not going to camera training facilities, but what we are going to do, hopefully, is enable the next generation of riders with the knowledge to recognize what's bad and the courage to come forward and do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Sally, on your side in the UK, what specific horse welfare aspects are you prioritizing?
We have about 5 or 6 years ago, we set up the Horse Welfare Board. So this is an independently chaired board that has people from outside of the industry as well that have set the direction for welfare and safety projects. And I think that's it's been a very well received by the industry action, and indeed it's reached its 5-year term and people will have to change, but the industry has agreed that it's been very useful for setting the direction and just holding us to account what we're doing. Now, as a part of that has been to review our communications strategy and work with our communications team to improve the way we communicate and engage with not just the audience, of course, but the people who are critical of the sport. And that has involved the development of a new website where we put the good, the bad, and the ugly, but with the aspiration to improve on it. We suffered one of our high-profile meetings last weekend. We had 3 horses that suffered, or 2 suffered exercise-associated sudden death, and 1 fell in a race, and which resulted in a death as well, which is a truly terrible day for the industry and the collections of the horses. But the way we've approached the communication around that has been much more transparent. We have not given the full details of the post-mortem results, but we have given some details of the post-mortem. We've explained what the fatality review process. We've just tried to sort of change our approach to how we engage with people, and I think that seems to be well received. Other things are to write this code. We are writing this code of conduct, this aspiration, and also to just keep chatting to people. We've already covered this communication piece, looking at the people who can help, people who are human behavioral specialists that can help guide our communication or where we put our projects, as well as making absolute improvements to welfare and safety of racehorses through reviewing how we expect them to race. We've developed risk models so that we can identify the risks that are greater and we can try and mitigate them. So it's been quite a flurry of activity, actually, and probably something to do with the crashed plane that Bettina mentioned.
Maybe I can ask Bronte to start with this second question. Could you give examples of cultural differences in viewing horse welfare issues that you've encountered?
Yeah, I guess I have a unique perspective here coming from Australia, where land is not an issue and horses live in 60-acre paddocks with 2 other horses, and Hong Kong, where we don't have any paddocks. All horses are stabled here. So all the exercise I get is being let out or ridden out. And I think in Hong Kong, that's accepted. People don't grow up around farms. They don't grow up around farm animals. They don't grow up around horses. and most won't even have pets. So for someone from Australia who has a completely different perspective of how a horse should live, and I think we discussed this a little bit earlier, and from someone from Hong Kong who, as long as the stable environment is clean, the temperature is controlled, the horse is well, the horse is fed well, the horse is looked after well, they accept that. Whereas I think Sally touched on this before. If we have visitors from overseas, they may come and say, but when do they get their paddock time? Well, when do they go out in a paddock? So that's sort of a cultural difference that we now have to look at, because we're not just dealing with the Hong Kong population now. We're not just dealing with the people of Hong Kong that come and visit their horse and they see it happy and it eats the carrots and they think it's great. Because we now have to answer to an international body, which I think is a positive thing. So we have to think about ways of how do we get good social interaction for those horses? How do we improve their lives in the environment that they're in now? And that stimulates academics to do research, and it stimulates people like ourselves to educate trainers. So, for example, recently we had a case of a trainer who wanted to put up plastic barriers between each of the stables because he was worried about medication control. He had a minor issue with contamination from one horse to another. So he came up with the idea he's going to put a plastic barrier between every single horse so that they can't touch each other. So it was an education piece for us to say, well, there's a better way to deal with that. If you do that, you're really affecting that horse's welfare because it needs interaction with other horses. So that's sort of one example from our perspective.
Mm-hmm. Sonja, I'm wondering, do you also experience some cultural differences across the states?
I think most of the cultural differences that we experience are across the breeds and disciplines. I mean, you've heard a couple of practices that were raised, for example, cutting tails. That's pretty unique to breeds. That's not common in the disciplines. Tying the head up or, putting PVC pipe in the mouth, or a block of wood to try to keep the mouth open. That's not something that is commonplace among all of the breeds and disciplines. So they, each of them are asking the horse to do something different. In eventing, for example, one phase of eventing is they're running fast, cross country, jumping big obstacles. Dressage, they're doing very specific movements in the ring. The show jumping, they're jumping obstacles. And in the hunters, for example, which is not it's more commonly in the United States, they are jumping some obstacles, but the judging is all subjective. Whereas in show jumping, they're going against a clock. They're timed, and then they're trying to clear obstacles without, rails falling down. In hunters, it's all subjective. So they want horses to be quiet. And that's where you hear a lot about, them using substances that do kind of that quiet horses. So depending on the breed or discipline and what the judging standards are, and they're asking the horse to do, is where you kind of see different practices. I mean, years and years ago, it was acceptable to pole horses, and that was in the jumping and the hunters so that they would clear obstacles when they jumped. You're not going to really see that with, some of, the hackney horses that are, running around a show ring with a cart on the back. So it's very different. And it's interesting because they tend to identify what the others are doing that is objectionable, but sometimes fail to see within their own discipline where there's some problems. So trying to help facilitate those conversations and help raise that level of awareness is important. But there's no question there's cultural differences and between the different breeds and disciplines.
So moving on to our last question here. The social license and the public curve is likely to continue its downward trajectory. In this social media era, unless the industry gets ahead of the curve, how can that be achieved?
We just need to do a better job, and it's about transparency for sure. But we need to do a better job of, as mentioned earlier, telling our good stories. We need to do a better job around enforcement. We need to do a better job around education. But most importantly, we just need to do a better job with our horses. We need to be much more mindful of what we understand now about horse cognition, about how horses learn, how not asking our horses to do things that are inherently unreasonable for that particular animal, trying to cram a square peg into a round hole. But I think if we do a better job and are seen to do a better job, and try to also recruit the next generation of horse lovers, which is something that certainly in Canada we haven't done a great job of, because horses are being treated at riding schools like a piece of sporting equipment. Pony club, the kids are not invited or allowed to, for liability reasons, to go put a halter on a horse, brush it, learn about horse care, really learn to bond with that animal. We need to be doing that to bond people to horses, so they see the value in horse ownership and human horse interactions outside of kind of high performance, and continue to tell the story of the great things that the outside of a horse does to the inside of a man. To quote Winston Churchill, we know that horses are used in therapy, for PTSD, for veterans that have been damaged by a war experience. There's just so much that we have to save and protect here, and we need to make sure that we're doing right by our horses. And if we do that, we will survive. Thank you.
We're just about to wrap up here. Does anyone else have any final thoughts?
Just quickly, sorry. I'm pleased with the plane crash analogy for the racing industry, because I think as an industry in racing, I feel like we do have some traction, and we are starting to get ahead of that curve. And I think through hard-learned lessons, that's been done through all those things that have just been mentioned now, which is admitting fault, communicating with people. If something's wrong, admitting it's wrong and how we're going to fix it. If something's perceived as wrong and it's not, communicating why and why we do things. And then importantly, holding people in the industry and each other accountable for what we do. I think there's a big push for that in the racing industry. And I think that the equestrian industry and other industries hopefully will learn from the racing industry's experience in that. We still have a lot of work to do, no doubt, but I think we're on the correct road now anyway in the racing industry. That's how I feel.
Well, thank you so much, Bronte, Sally, Bettina, and Sonja, for your time and expertise. That concludes our Q&A session.